All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's small business webinar. My name is Paul LaChapelle. I'm with Montana State University, and happy to welcome you all to this week's edition of the small business webinar. I'd like to remind you we are recording today's small business webinar, and we'll be posting the archive link on our website. You can see that website in the chat box. Should be on the right side of your screen, and if you don't see that, you should have a little icon at the bottom of your screen. It's a little circle with a bump out at about 7 o'clock, and you can click on that. We do encourage questions throughout the presentation. I'll be monitoring those and interrupting our presenter as those questions come up, and we'll also have an opportunity at the end for questions. Just like to ask that you mute your phones or your computers for the duration of the webinar. You will have a chance at the end if you want to unmute yourself, and I can help to facilitate that. But again, throughout the webinar, please keep your lines muted. Today's webinar is sponsored by Montana State University Extension Community Development Program, the Montana Economic Developers Association, the Small Business Development Centers, which are affiliated with the Montana Department of Commerce and the U.S. Small Business Administration, with additional support from the Great Falls Development Authority and the University of Montana. If you have any technical support questions, feel free to call the number or email me at the address again in the chat box. Again, I mentioned you'll have opportunities for questions. Feel free to type those into the chat box. If you have any questions about how to use that chat box, feel free again to email or call me. So it's my pleasure now to introduce today's speaker. Bobby Burkhoff is an employment and labor law attorney with Church, Harris, Johnson, and Williams, PC, based in Great Falls. So with that, Bobby, it's great to have you with us. Go ahead and take it away.
All right, great. Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. Paul and Jason and Deb have asked me to speak to you on the issue of legal liability, particularly as it relates to Governor Bullock's latest orders regarding the phase 1 opening during the COVID crisis. And I'm happy to be here, and let's get started. This is a roadmap for today's presentation. As Paul said, I'm also happy to take any questions as we go along. Paul has the green light to interrupt me if you forward your questions through that chat function. We are very fortunate to call Montana home, and no one during this crisis has all the answers. So I'll do my best to fill you in on what I've learned and know up to this date, but I can tell you that by the time this presentation is over, the law will have already changed. So consult your professionals and or contact me after the presentation if you have any questions. So today we're going to talk about a little bit about legal liability and what that means. We're going to talk about mitigating your risk as an entrepreneur or a small business owner. We're also going to talk about the impacted areas, potentially areas that you might not be cognizant of, and then resources that are available for you. So first off, what exactly is legal liability? And legal liability, according to Black's Law Dictionary, you can see there is the state of being bound or obliged in law or justice to do or pay or make good something or legal responsibility. So what does that mean? Every situation is going to be a balance of facts and circumstances. So no individual lawsuit or case or issue of legal liability is going to be the same. You need to take a look at each facts and circumstances. Your individual businesses, for example, we have folks from all over Great Falls and all over the state in various different professions. And so once you take a look at the facts and circumstances, then we take a look at the precedent and the law and the legal determination that can apply to those facts and circumstances. So court rulings, local, state, and federal statutes, and then guidelines play into that as well, which is part of what we're talking about today. This is also ever fluid and ever changing. And this is particularly fluid with our current COVID crisis because again, by the time we're done today, something new will have happened. In fact, as I was getting ready for this presentation, I had to go back and correct things just since last week, Friday. So that's how fast things are changing. So the reasonable person is the standard which applies in legal liability. And the term legal person refers to just an ordinary human being who is basically middle of the road. You're not a far extreme in boldness. You're not a far extreme in carefulness. And as a business, you want to make the decision, the best decision, based on all of the information that you have available to you, and acting in compliance with those guidelines will mitigate your risk and your exposure to legal liability. So compliance with the current orders, the current guidelines, it also provides you with an affirmative defense if you were to, and hopefully this is never the case, but find yourself involved in litigation regarding all things COVID. So this is an example that I had, and if you could imagine a third picture on this slide with an agoraphobe who never leaves the house, it kind of gives you the spectrum of the reasonable person standard. Ultimately, that reasonable person is decided by your judge or your jury. But to the left, we have Mother's Day diners in Colorado. That diner opened against the state's orders. In the middle, we have a place in Georgia that is in the first phase of reopening. You can see that there's plastic bags on the back of the chairs separating diners. The employees are wearing face masks. And then imagine a third person hiding in their house. So your reasonable person is going to be that middle of the line and is never an extreme. The beauty about living in America is we have choices, and that includes the choice to join 100 of your not so close friends in a diner. It also includes a choice to follow suit. And we've been seeing quite a few new cases that have been popping up here in the last couple of weeks, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But COVID-related cases have now been filed in nearly every state. So in general, and I'm sure that this is general information for everyone that's participating, folks like to go after the deepest pockets. When you file suit for injury or whatever the rationale for filing suit, the plaintiffs are usually looking to get made whole, and that usually comes from naming the deepest pocket. And I'll get into that as we get into this a little bit further as well. So this is a bulletin from Montana Secretary of State Corey Stapleton. And I've tried to make sure that I reference the websites on all the slides, which will be made available after this presentation concludes. And the reason that I put this here is because we're talking about this being 5 days ago now. His bulletin referenced United States unemployment, which has already changed. He mentioned that he had 11,000 fewer businesses renew their registrations this year. And this kind of demonstrates the fluidity of COVID. The numbers are constantly changing. And I put this in here mostly because during all things COVID, a lot of people had their normal schedules interrupted. So if you haven't renewed your registration with the Secretary of State, this is your reminder to do so. Montana has been on the cutting edge of this crisis. We have been the government made decisions early on that allowed us to get ahead and help start flattening the curve. And Governor Bullock has issued the reopening guidelines. I'm not going to get into these slides individually. That's why they're so small. It's mostly so that you recognize what they look like when you get to them. And if you haven't reviewed these guidelines, this is where I would tell you to start. And then there's new guidelines as of today because Governor Bullock issued the orders that there can be now reopenings of gyms, museums, and movie theaters. So there's additional guidance for those particular arenas. Governor Bullock issued a three-phase approach, and I'm going to be focusing primarily on that first phase. We still are limiting or attempting to limit and contain the spread of COVID, but we also want to continue to progress to what I've only ever heard referred to as our quote unquote new normal. And so that is, these guidelines are helping us get to what that looks like. So in reviewing Governor Bullock's orders, there's a few things that are recommended, and then there's a few things that are required. And I won't delve down into each one of those in particular, except for to tell you that sanitation procedures, social distancing policies, personal protection equipment are recommended and required in some situations. So each individual business and each individual business's footprint requires a different review. So you'll want to take a look at those guidelines. Again, this entire crisis is fluid, so make sure that you come back and check regularly for any updates or any guidelines. Your compliance with these guidelines is going to limit your exposure to liability. And so as we've seen, what goes up must come down. Again, in government, it also goes back up. So you could see that President Trump passed it off to the individual states governors, and then the states governors passed on some things down to the local levels, and we see that most prevalently with the individual school boards deciding whether or not to reopen their facilities. And so, but then also it can go back up because for example, Cascade County Health Department refers back to the federal level with the CDC, the Centers of Disease Control, for sanitation practices. And I'll get into this more later, but in case we run out of time, I want to make sure that you're taking the time to document and photograph your compliance with these guidelines. That includes, if you mark off your floors with tape, if you post signage, if you have hand sanitizer, where you place your hand sanitizer, if you have gloves or personal protection equipment available for your employees or for your customers. You want to make sure at this point, from a legal perspective, to make sure that you're preserving and documenting your compliance. And again, these are local law enforcement has been given the green light from the government to enforce laws and compliance with the directives. And I say this particularly because what happens in Cascade County might not apply to Gallatin County, might not apply to Lake County. So you'll want to make sure that if you do have any questions about whether or not you're in compliance with something that could bring in law enforcement, that you're contacting your local authorities. I have found that the best signage readily available for folks to use was on the Gallatin County Health Department's website. They have made all of their signs available to the public, and they did that early on. And also, just as a warning to everyone, I know it's easy to go down that rabbit hole, but some websites are more user-friendly than others. It sometimes requires a little bit of patience to get to the information that you need. But again, we're lucky to live in Montana and people still answer the phones. So if you do have any specific questions about particularly the sanitation component, call your local health department. If it's about something that is in regards to potentially enforcement, contact your local law enforcement authorities. So this is probably the biggest area of change, and there's also guidance from 100 different sources. So personal protection equipment and social distancing go hand in hand. And if one is impractical, then masks and protection equipment is necessary. Again, in some situations, for example, barbers and beauticians, masks are definitely part of that mandatory guideline for compliance if you want to mitigate your risk. Again, it's America. We all have choices. You can choose to comply or not, and we'll get into that a little bit later. You want to enact a sanitation or a disinfection policy right away and hold to that policy. If it means appointing an employee or regularly following those policies, you'll want to do that regularly and always document. In regards to employee symptom screening, this again is one of those areas where we don't necessarily know the answer to this yet, but we're basing current approaches on the guidelines that are available to us. And so employees, a symptom screening is required according to the guidelines, and the CDC has set 100.4 degrees temperature Fahrenheit as the threshold. Now, up until this COVID crisis, taking an employee's temperature was considered a medical screening, which violated federal and most state laws. And so the theory right now that is in light of this pandemic, that this medical screening for temperatures falls under emergency exceptions under several different acts. But it is compensable work time. So if you have employees coming to work and you're having them pre-screened before they arrive at work, that is compensable work time. And even if it's 2 or 3 minutes, make sure that you're noting that at some point on their timesheets. And there are forms on the state's website that are very easy to follow. Those are the default ones. Obviously, you can make your own policy if you'd like. Just adhere to the directions that are being given. The EEOC last week issued additional guidance with discrimination and retaliation laws. And I think that this is pretty important for us to touch on because we have an area of the population, vulnerable adults, those with over the age of 65 or with pre-existing medical health conditions. And it's important to note that folks that fall into this category cannot be barred from returning to work based solely on their status as that vulnerable adult. And so you want to make sure that you're still following and complying with the Human Rights Bureau and the EEOC in regards to discrimination and retaliation laws. And that means watching out for exclusivity or adverse actions in employment. And an example of that would be if you had Susie who's 6 months pregnant and she gets a plastic screen in front of her workstation, but no one else in the office gets a plastic screen. That's an exclusionary tactic, which points to her pregnancy. And that's just one example. It doesn't have to be pregnancy. It could be someone that has recently gone through chemo that gets a screen and no one else gets a plastic screen. Those are exclusionary tactics that can land you in hot water with the EEOC or the Montana Human Rights Bureau. So even if you conclude that this employee is that it's a concrete threat to their health, that returning to work, you still are required to engage in that interactive process, talking about reasonable accommodations, getting to whether or not it's a hardship. So just make sure you're still engaging in that process. And again, preserve your evidence. The health screening, the symptom screening are confidential. You cannot share the results of your employee's health screening with anybody except for those discrete in management, and they should not be shared publicly or amongst other staff. This screen is just a hodgepodge of information that is showing you that we are ever changing and that there is no precedent at this point. On Wednesday this week, attorney generals from 20 states called for industry standards to protect workers. And this letter was in response to a Tuesday letter from 21 attorney generals from different states demanding that corporate immunity and shields be put in place for civil suits that are COVID related. And I mention this because 8 weeks ago, we still didn't know the duration of the infectiousness of the virus. We didn't know how it spread. We didn't know. And so we are now 8 weeks in and still don't have a lot of answers. Just know that until Congress and the courts decide on whether we protect workers or protect businesses, or there's a compromise between the both, we don't know how precedent or COVID is going to affect lawsuits. In regards to your particular business, attorneys know the law, but we don't know everything. And what I can tell you is that in the course of this last 8 weeks and helping my other employers, I have learned that there are a lot of facets that work into everybody's individual business that you might not, or I as an attorney was not cognizant of. And so contacting your business advisors, your financial advisors, your accountants, your insurance agents, your frontline professionals, your local authorities, no one person is going to know all of the answers. And if you find that person, please email me their name and number, or continue checking and fact checking with other people, because this crisis is so broad and far-reaching implications that it requires your team to help you make sure that you're protected. So I am presenting from my dining room table, and I'm blessed to work for a firm that was on the technical edge and was set up for us to work remotely. But with working remotely, there comes a lot of issues. So in the last 3 weeks, I've gone to court on Skype. I've gone to court on Real Presence. I've attended meetings on Zoom and Microsoft Teams. Today is my first go at WebEx Cisco. And then I saw this morning that Google has now added their Google Meet. And so there's good things and bad things with each of the programs. And it's necessary for some businesses to be able to do this, especially with the limitations on travel and the self-quarantine post-travel. I point this out because our IT person has said that it's very, very difficult to get people to jump on to the essential software because of its cost prohibitive. That said, I can show you that on the left here is the fake coronavirus map. It looks like it's from Johns Hopkins University. It's not. It was a data mining malware that folks were inadvertently installing into their systems without knowing. And on the right, we have last weekend, Billings Church was Zoomed bombed with child pornography. And again, I circle back to folks are going to go after the largest pocket in particularly in personal injury suits. And so this Billings Church is not alone by this individual person that Zoom bombed them, is what they're calling it. There was also a church in California that was Zoom bombed this past week. And they didn't sue the individual that uploaded the child pornography in their worship service. What they did was filed suit against Zoom itself, and that's a class action that was filed this week in California. So just make sure that you are paying attention to how your employees, if they're remote accessing in, are doing that. Each individual laptop needs to be protected, as well as the other end, the desktop in the physical office. And I put this up because this is one of my favorite stories. This is a teacher from Georgia who got an insurance policy for a trip to, she and her husband were going on their 40th anniversary or something. And she read the fine print and got all the way to the bottom of the contract and realized that there was this, hey, if you call in, the first one to call in or fill out this email or fill out this form gets $10,000, and she won $10,000. The irony is that I think nearly 75 policies had been issued before hers. And so she, it's just gold stars to any of the listeners today that have actually gone through their entire insurance policy. I am guilty that I have not. I practice what I preach, not what I do. But if your insurance policy doesn't cover employee issues or doesn't cover cyber attacks, refer back to your insurance agent to see if there's additional coverage or an additional rider that you need, especially particularly during this crisis. Business advisors and financial advisors are the best place to know the programs that are available to help you. Congress is still working on additional legislation, so you want to continue to keep in contact with them. As of Wednesday, I believe that there was still 120 billion left in that second round of finances for the payroll protection program. And then also, just as a side note, keep track of all of your COVID related expenses, even if you're not involved in the payroll protection program, because we don't know at this point what the ultimate tax treatment and financial treatment is going to be for this crisis. And so you're going to save yourself a bunch of time if you start keeping track of those expenses and that information now, as opposed to trying to backtrack at the end of the year.
A question just came up, if I could
Sure.
interrupt. Is this virus event a case for force majeure in contractual obligation? So maybe you want to.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Burns, for being right on time, because the first component of my next slide is contracts. So I love it when a plan comes together. There is not a decision on whether or not COVID will be part of force majeure. This is part of the litigation and establishing precedent that I started off on. There, ultimately, this is something that is going to probably go all the way up and then back down again. There could be some issues regarding the law of each state might conflict. But at this point, we're gonna see it raised as an affirmative defense under force majeure. And for those that don't know, force majeure is basically anything that's outside of your control part of your contract. So and it can impact in different components. We saw when the emergency orders were initially put in that eviction processes for landlord-tenant issues would not be allowed. That is explicitly part of that program that would have influenced the force majeure portion of a rental agreement. I think this is something that's going to be very fluid, and we're going to have to circle back on that when the cases finally get through the legal process. There are several different continuing legal education and various other webinars that are force majeure specific. So if the person asking the question wants to send me an email, I can put them in contact with those actually specific questions. But our firm just attended a contracts plea, 3 or 4 of our attorneys, and the result was after 2 hours, there still was no answer. So again, keeping up on what's up to date, we won't know until a court makes a decision on that component, and then we won't know until that appeal process is fully effectuated. So hurry up and wait is my best answer for whether or not force majeure applies. In addition to the business planning component, attorneys and everyone is really facing this end of life issues. So estate planning and business or farm succession plans are also something that we've seen an uptick in, as well as bankruptcies and corporate litigation. If you have employees and they are on job attached layoffs, make sure that you're paying attention to the unemployment insurance benefits forms and statements that are coming back on your accounts with the governor's orders and the original Families First Act that passed. Your accounts and your ratings shouldn't be affected by this current crisis, so you'll want to make sure that you're paying attention to those statements. And again, we already talked about it, but discrimination and retaliation charges can stem from COVID-related decisions, and you'll want to make sure that you have that legitimate business reason to take that action. And ultimately, the choice is yours. You have the ability to comply, and the costs for compliance are masks, personal protection gear, sanitation, supplies, wipes, hand sanitizers, your time and energy. Most of all, the downside is your time and potential wait for the delivery of supplies. People have been worried about sanitation wipes. I know National Laundry here in Great Falls started making their own. They've been worried about hand sanitizer because it's not readily available. I know that Bozeman Spirits Distillery just started to make their own hand sanitizer. If you're looking for sustainable masks, the local Hutterite colonies have been sewing like crazy. In fact, the one here closest to Great Falls has donated over 8,000 masks to frontline workers. That might be a source of contact. The struggle is finding the supplies. The alternate to that is the cost of non-compliance, and that boils down to ultimately settlements or judgments. And I talked earlier about deep pockets, but there's been a family filed a suit against Walmart here in the last month regarding a COVID death of one of their employees. The California church suing Zoom, the beautician in Texas going to jail, the armed AK-47s outside of the New Jersey tattoo parlor, EEOC filings. I just read yesterday that a 75-year-old resident of a nursing home in Portland, Oregon, his estate has filed a wrongful death against the nursing home. And OSHA is now recommending that residents all be screened. And so the choice is ultimately yours. The struggle now to comply with Governor Bullock's orders, or the potential consequence of being held legally liable for your non-compliance. And then, just as I'm running over, a final note is to make sure that you are doing self-care. There's a lot of anxiety that has come with this. People working from home while also teaching their kids remote access online learning, 100 different ways that this has affected people and their anxiety. So practice some good self-care. There's some resources that I've referenced in this presentation here for you to review. And then my contact information, if you have any questions after this presentation, I am available to answer those questions. You can email me or contact me. I will be happy to answer your phone calls from my dining room table in my bunny slippers. And so thank you also to Paul and Deb and Jason, who helped me get on the tech side of these things, and for the invitation to present today. I appreciate the opportunity. And Paul listed off all the people at the beginning that were the sponsors of this. I was attempting to keep track to thank them again at the end, but go back to the beginning and review them, and I'm thanking them for their sponsorship.
Great, thanks, Bobby. We've got a few minutes for questions. You can either type them into the chat box, you can type them in to everyone or anonymously to me and I'll read them out. Or you can see there's a raise hand icon next to your name if you'd like to unmute yourself, and I'll just call on you. So I'll see if anybody has wants to raise their hand and actually state their question either through their computer or phone. So go ahead and do that now if you'd like. And I see a question here. Rich is asking a question, Bobby. Could you clarify a bit on the point you made about exclusionary part you mentioned? For example, if you have an employee who is immune compromised and they return to work and you make some special accommodations for them and they end up getting sick, can they cause liability to you? Or is it that if the other employees were not afforded the special accommodation, end up getting sick, can that cause the liability?
So there's two parts to this question, Paul. The first is about the special accommodations under the discrimination and retaliation laws with the EEOC and the Montana Human Rights Bureau. The second one is just liability for getting a COVID-related sickness in general. And so in regards to individual employers' liability for the COVID-related illnesses of their employees, that has not yet been decided yet. Congress is still working on the back and forth about employer protections with immunity shields or industry standards for employees. And so that's not a question that we can answer just yet, other than to make sure that if you're complying with all the guidelines that Governor Bullock has issued and your local county health department has issued, then you're at least mitigating your exposure to that liability. As far as the special accommodations goes, that's the separate question. If you are singling out an employee that somehow demonstrates their protected class, then you can be responsible for liability for discrimination. And so there's a difference between the two. And so the example that I gave was a pregnant woman having a plastic shield put up at her workstation. Insert whatever protected class you want there: pregnant female, an older adult, a cancer survivor, someone undergoing immunosuppressant therapies, whatever that person is. You want to make sure that you are not treating that person any differently than everyone else. And again, that comes down to engaging in that interactive process, having that individual assessment, working out whether or not there's a reasonable accommodation that doesn't cause an undue hardship, and then implementing that. But as you see, like Albertsons and Smith's here in town, Walmart, they all have plastic shields that protect themselves between the customer and the employee. If you're doing it for everyone, you limit the liability and the exposure on the discrimination component.
Great, thanks, Bobby. We've got a couple more questions in the chat, but I see that Pam has raised her hand. Pam, do you want to unmute yourself?
We are a 501c3. Okay, we're a 501c3 tax exempt nonprofit, but we act as a fiscal sponsor for about 20 small nonprofits underneath us. Can I or require that each program manager watch this presentation and attest that they have?
Pam, that's up to you. This was pretty general information, and kind of that 30,000-foot view. If you think the information in here is informative, I would have them watch it. As far as requiring your affiliates or your subsidiaries to do something, mostly what you should be forcing them to do is following the guidelines, because that's what limits the exposure to liability. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. And Bobby, we've got a couple of more questions in the chat box. I'll read these again for the recording purposes. The first one and the next two are kind of related. Lynette says, I'm a massage therapist in Red Lodge, Montana. No employees, just myself. I have people from out of state visitors calling for massage. I don't want to discriminate. I am supposed to screen and they are to quarantine for 14 days if out of state. How do I stay out of trouble with lawsuits with this without singling out of state travelers and discrimination laws?
So I'm not sure that you would necessarily be held accountable for any sort of discrimination. That's you are a business owner, you're allowed to provide your services. You have that discretion to those that you want to. In regards to the self-quarantine, again, that is a guidance that's been issued by the governor that all travelers from out of state that are traveling for non-work purposes self-quarantine for 14 days. We could see that relax a little bit as we've seen the governor issue the orders with the gyms, which include pools and some massage therapy, at least here in town with the Peak. The problem isn't the liability with you in doing massage for someone from out of state. That's not on you. That's on that individual being held responsible. And again, that boils down to each individual county's law enforcement entities. So that might be a secondary question that you want to follow up with your local law authority. But I don't think that you need to worry about providing services and using the out of state or they're from Wyoming as a discriminatory factor. That's not that's discrimination, yes, but not the discrimination that falls under Equal Opportunity or Human Rights Bureau. It's your discretion.
Thanks, Bobby. Looks like she did have a follow-up question and wanted to unmute herself.
Sure.
Want to do that? Go ahead now. Not sure if she's able to. I'll follow up with the next question in the chat, Bobby. Are there any issues? Oh, Lynette, are you there? No, I guess not. The next question, are there any issues with requiring employees to self-quarantine for 14 days after traveling out of state, personal travel, and requiring them to use PTO during the quarantine period?
So that's going to default to your handbook or your employee manual. And or any changes you make to that policy. And the again, we're back to the point where we haven't fully litigated all of these issues. So I can't speak exactly to that without knowing more information about how an individual business's employment policy is written. But as far as if it's for personal travel and it's not COVID related and it doesn't fall into that FMLA categories under the Families First Act, all of those components factor into this fact and circumstance. So it would depend on how large of an entity you are. It would depend on your personnel policies. I wish I could give a more specific answer, but I'm unable to do so with just that question.
Great, thanks, Bobby. Another question, has the doctrine of reasonable person shifted to informed?
So not yet. I think that is probably coming. The reasonable person standard is the reasonable person standard that's applied in one case may not be the same exact reasonable person standard that's applied in another case. And the reason being is because your trier of fact, your judge or jury is going to be given the instructions on what a reasonable person is. And that's an ordinary person. Your Joe Plumber, Joe Schmo, Jane Doe, and it's going to be not the extremes. So if you take the militant, unmasked, armed protester outside the state capitol versus someone who hasn't left their house in the last 8 or 9 weeks, your reasonable person is going to be in between those two parties. And so informed gets more into the mitigation of your liability. So the informed component is what mitigates your liability, allows you to provide an affirmative defense that, hey, listen, this is what the governor said, this is what the CDC said, this is what my local county health department said, this is what my sheriff's office said, so this is what I did. I did everything that was available to me as far as to being informed. Obviously, the reasonable person isn't someone that's got their head in the clouds or isn't exposed to life and the new normal as we now know it. So I think the informed component is part of that creation of what is this reasonable person.
Thanks, Bobby. We've got some more questions in the chat box, but I know Lynette wanted to follow up with her previous question. Lynette, you're unmuted now if you want to ask your question. Lynette, if you're there. Doesn't look like we're able to unmute Lynette. Or
if Lynette wants to just give me a call, I'll be available right after this. If she wants to just give me a call, my phone number is on that last screen.
Great. Let me, I'll see if I can work with her to unmute her. And in the meantime, another question. If you've been working remotely during this time and able to accomplish your duties, can an employer require you to go back to the office to work? Not forever, but until there is a vaccine.
So, well, I can't answer to the vaccine because I have been trying to follow the medical end of things, and I don't even know if a vaccine is a viable option. So absent the vaccine, let's just take the first chunk of that question as far as working remotely. The governor's orders have recommended during this phase 1 approach that if you can work remotely, that you should. And if you're getting pushback from your employer about being forced to come back into the office, you should have a conversation with that employer. If it's the employer thinking that everything should go back to normal and wants to force its employees to come back into the office, they should review Governor Bullock's orders and phase 1 guidelines and see that that there is this trying to still suppress the curve of the COVID spread, and working from home and working remotely is still strongly encouraged.
Great. I'm going to go ahead and unmute now. Lynette, are you there? Go ahead, Lynette. Lynette, are you there? All right, doesn't seem to be working. Sorry about that.
No, that's fine. Just I'll make sure that I'm available for the next half hour after we sign off, and Lynette can call me.
Sounds good.
Can you hear me at all?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Lynette.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I don't know what's going on. It shows that I'm muted and I keep hitting the button. So I have a question as far as like, because I do give massage and it's such a close area. It's in a room and stuff. Can't have the door open or anything because it's, privacy. And it is difficult to wear a mask when you're massaging. I'm not sick or anything. I haven't been out of the state or anything. So how do I keep myself from getting in hot water from anything I'm doing? Like I could carry it and not know it, or you know what I mean? Because they're saying you could be where you have it and you don't even know. I just don't want to get in where I pass it, even though I'm not sick.
So the hope is that the testing will become more readily available, and you can check with your county health department. I forget where which county Red Lodge is in. Check with
Morgan County.
So check
And
with,
they have hardly anything on there
okay,
as far
so
as resources.
on their website. So if in each individual county was responsible for, you know, kind of disseminating their own information, that doesn't mean that you can't jump on other counties' websites to see if there's any frequently asked questions or guidance for your business in particular. Each county is going to drill down, and if yours is silent, following the best practices of one of the larger counties might not be a bad idea. As far as the close proximity that you're working on, unfortunately, and you're probably going to hate to hear this because I can only imagine mouth breathing in a mask for the whole entire hour while you're working out, but the governor's guidance is that you do wear that mask. That's best practice. And so it not only to protect your clients, but also to protect yourself from your clients. As far as your customers go, you can't force them to wear a mask. That's their own individual discretion.
Okay.
So Gallatin County it was very easy navigable. Cascade County is pretty easily navigable. And in just the difference is that you either social distance or you mask up. And right now with all of the personal care providers, masking up is the requirement.
Well, and I have worn a mask. It's just, I find that it's challenging. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I was just like, didn't know. And I want to protect both of us. It's just kind of one of those things like, they're kind of hard to find here in Red Lodge. So I have cloth masks that I've been using and wash them readily. So just looking for pointers.
And be careful how long you spend going down the Google machine, down the rabbit hole, because you will find 100 different selections. But I saw one recently that I have the world's smallest ears, so wearing a mask doesn't work for me because they just slide off my ears. There was one that I saw that allowed you to cut a t-shirt, in an old t-shirt, in such a way that you could tie it at the top of your head and then at the base of your neck. And then that secured it without hurting your ears or having elastic, because you can tie the t-shirt stretchy material in such a way that it covers your face. Again, if you know of a local Hutterite colony, they have been seriously stepping up to the task, and skilled sewers. And so they've been providing masks all over the state. And then there's also another option with a bandana, but if you're wearing it for an entire hour or 90 minutes or however long your massages are, you want to make sure that you're comfortable as well. That t-shirt idea is probably the best that suits what you're explaining is your issues with your particular situation. And then you're covered, and then you don't have to you're mitigating your exposure to liability because you're doing something that they've asked.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
You aren't,
well, thank
you aren't
you.
in a situation to have to scrounge up and try to 5 and N95 mask. You are just in the section of businesses that requires masks on the provider in a closed setting.
Yeah, and I have, like I said, the cloth masks, and I've been using them. It's just I'm finding they're hard to breathe, and I've just not done a lot because it's challenging.
Yeah. Google machine that t-shirt idea, because that sounds like it would be the most user friendly.
Yeah, it sounds like I could actually breathe.
That's the hard side, and it gets hot and it gets sweaty, and we are in Montana. I've noticed a lot of people are not masking up, and those that are getting kind of this sideways look of who are you and why are you masked. So but err on the side of caution, because that's what limits your liability.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. And thanks for the discrimination, because I was afraid I would get in trouble by saying, get myself into hot water by saying, well, because we're so close to the border of Wyoming.
Sure.
It's an hour.
Yeah.
So it's like,
And depending on
oh,
what Wyoming has done as far as their opening orders, you might be the option because they haven't reopened yet. So, but you have that discretion to take or not take clients.
and I can't get sued for that.
No.
Okay. That was my big concern because we have to self-screen them. And that's the other thing. Like, I don't know how to self-screen. I mean, I ask them, like, have you been sick, or, you know, you need to notify us if you come down with anything, or, you know, over the symptoms and so forth. But, you know, it's challenging to know, you know, how to protect yourself, because a lot of times I do it over the phone.
So the state has a form that you can look at that gives
Oh.
you the exact questions that you should be asking, mostly about their symptoms, and then if the answer is no to the symptoms, then about their travel outside of the state is one of them, and then there's a secondary question on family members or close ones also being affected.
Okay, because I've looked all over the internet. Where did you find that form? Because I haven't seen it.
So that should be on the list of resources that I have. It's on both the Department of Health and Human Services website, and it's on the covid19.mt.gov site.
And we'll be
Okay.
posting this PDF along with the recording probably on Monday. So you'll have access to all of this this information on our website, again, that I've posted at the top of the chat. So
And I would
Oh,
say
okay.
either Gallatin and I haven't been on Yellowstone County's health website, but I would say just with your proximity, Gallatin or Yellowstone County's health department's websites would be another good place to start.
And you just look under forms. And so this, I'm sorry, while you were talking, I was trying to take a picture of this so I have it for this weekend, because I'm probably going to get calls for massage. And so I wanted to know where the forms are. You said where exactly on this page of resources?
The covid19.mt.gov.
Okay. And that it's under forms?
Yeah, I can't. I am unable to jump onto the internet while I'm doing the
okay.
webinar, but that's
okay.
that's where I found forms when we were originally going back into the office.
Okay.
Lynette,
Okay. I'll
thanks for
start there. Thank you.
That's
your
also
question, Lynette.
that's also the website that the county attorney that I work with frequently pointed out as far as the forms that he passed out to his county for his businesses to use.
Thanks, Bobby. And thanks, Lynette, for your question. We're coming up to the top of the hour. I just want to see if there's any last questions from anyone. You can type them in or feel free to raise your hand. And Bobby, Jason just wrote, if you could forward the slide deck to me, I can distribute it to Lynette and the rest of the attendees in my follow-up email. So,
Perfect.
and you could do that as a PDF if you want to. It'll be a smaller file. Any last questions for Bobby? Questions or comments? All right, seeing none. Any last words from you, Bobby, to close things out?
No, just thanks for having me today, and stay safe, everyone.
All right, Bobby, thanks so much. We appreciate it. We'll be having another webinar next week. Stay tuned for more information. You can join our listserv, again, going to the website at the top of the chat box. Until we meet again, thanks everybody for joining us today, and please be safe, be healthy, and stay positive. Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks, Paul.